Network for New Music Audiences. Today we are here with an interview with Viet Cuong, who's going to be one of the featured composers on our upcoming concert on February 26th at the University of Pennsylvania in Rose Hall and February 27th at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. Welcome, Viet. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me. Doing well.
Good to have you here. Where are we finding you today?
I'm coming from Las Vegas today.
You are. Excellent. Well, thanks for taking the time. On our concert, we're going to be featuring your piece, Wax and Wire, which we'll talk about later. But you have a local connection to Philadelphia as you attended the Curtis Institute. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience and when you were here?
Yeah, sure. So I was a student in their post-baccalaureate diploma program between 2017 to 19. And it was kind of the last degree program that I was enrolled in as a student. And it was an amazing time. I think all of you know it's a really wonderful school and really intimate environment. And it's a school I admired for so long. And the faculty there, I remember just even as a high school kid, like knowing who Jennifer Higdon was, and just I don't know, I remember like meeting Jennifer Higdon at like a concert in Baltimore because I was doing my undergrad in Baltimore years ago, and just be kind of like starstruck. And so it's really a dream come true to be able to study at Curtis. And I remember the reasoning I wanted to go there was because I really admired the faculty, but also I hadn't written much orchestral music yet at that point in my life. So I kind of wanted to go to a place where I would have opportunities to do that. And Curtis has such a storied orchestra there. So
Yes, they do indeed. And you said you studied composition there, is that right?
yes.
Yeah, but you also have background in performance too. Aren't you have some training playing percussion and clarinet?
Yes. When I was in middle school, I joined band and I played percussion. And I played percussion throughout high school as well. So I was like in marching band and concert band and percussion ensemble. But I also learned clarinet in high school because I wanted to march clarinet in these parades that my high school marching band was in. And a lot of my friends played clarinet as well. And as a young and budding composer then at like age 14 or whatever, it was really useful for me to learn a wind instrument, just to learn how they work. And when you write for percussion, the approach is very different than when you write for a wind instrument. And there's just other things to consider that I never knew about until I learned the clarinet. So
Yeah, and I mentioned the clarinet specifically because it's included in Wax and Wire, and just wondering if any of that sort of background influence helps you to write for instruments today, even though you had sort of formative training in it.
Oh yeah, definitely. Wax and Wire is a piece where the clarinet, out of all four of instruments in that piece, the clarinet is the kind of the feature instrument. And for that piece in particular, it's not just like writing for clarinet in a sort of typical way. The clarinet part has what are called quarter tones. So if you imagine a piano, there are the notes in a chromatic scale, one note after the other, but a quarter tone scale actually includes the notes that are in between the notes on the piano. So all that is to say that the clarinet is not designed to play that way. And so these are extended techniques that usually if you can play the instrument that you're writing for, that uses these extended techniques, it's very useful because I could actually test all of these fingerings for these quarter tones and make sure they all worked.
Yeah, and we have Thomas Piercy playing the clarinet part on this, so we're very happy to have him featured on that special part on this important piece. Now, you had mentioned that you opted to go to Curtis because of you wanted to write more for orchestra. So I wonder if you could just tell our audiences a little bit about your different approaches towards, say, writing for orchestra versus writing for band, because you've written considerable amount of music, versus, say, writing for chamber music.
Yeah, it's on some level when you start a piece, no matter what piece it is, at least I start small. So I will start usually like at the piano, and it usually starts with a chord or melody that I like. And um, kind of that is the seed for whatever the piece will be. So if it ends up being an orchestra piece, at the end of the day, you just kind of have more options of what you can do with this chord or melody. When you have 60 people and all these different colors, it's really kind of it's tantalizing to be able to write for so many people and to have so many options for how you want to orchestrate something. Um, and on the flip side, writing for such big groups like orchestra or band, it comes with some practical concerns. Like when you are writing for 60 people, uh, it's kind of hard sometimes to make 60 people play together, as opposed to writing a chamber piece for 4 people or a solo piece where it's just one person. You don't have to worry about one person just figuring out what they're doing. So I really like writing for all sorts of ensembles, but when I write for chamber music, instrumentations, sometimes it's just it feels more freeing because you don't have to worry about as many practical concerns, and rehearsal time being very limited with larger ensembles because you have to find a time in the day where 60 people can get together. Whereas with a chamber ensemble, you just have more flexibility. And so a piece like Wax and Wire with these clarinet quarter tones, I would never write a clarinet part like that for an orchestra
Mm.
because it's just so much uh there's just so much less rehearsal time. And on the flip side though, like if like the sound that an orchestra or band can get is so powerful and big that 4 people can try to get a sound that big, but it's just you just kind of almost don't think of it that way. It's like, oh, I
Yeah.
don't need it to sound that big because it's a chamber piece. It's a different it's like kind of a different animal.
In a different interview, I heard you once talking about the craft of composition, and you spoke rather elegantly about cohesion. And something you mentioned, a quote from this interview, is that you said that your musical voice is a product of your impatience. And
Mhm.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how that applies to Wax and Wire and to writing for these particular instruments.
Yeah, I try to even remember what that interview was. I think it was one of those pre-COVID interviews before the world changed. But yeah, I think I still feel that same way um, where like I would say like a lot of my music or most of it, if not all, is I try to be really focused in it.
Mhm.
So I like writing these pieces where there's kind of one unifying idea, whether it's an extra musical idea or a little musical something that kind of ties it all together. Because I think I'm at my best when my music is really focused like that.
Mm.
Um, for me, it works well that way. Obviously, for composers like Mahler or something, so many different ideas in one piece and works well for him. But just for me, um, I enjoy like kind of uh, making a whole piece, even if it's 20 minutes long, kind of based off of one little seed of something. Kind of think of it like I prefer like even if something is like a big oak tree, it grew from one seed originally, as opposed to like a big garden where there's like a ton of different uh different plants in the garden or something. And I think that is a product of impatience, perhaps because I just like really want to just like write something, and not think too much, like not think too long about it. Um, and so with Wax and Wire, it's this unifying idea is the clarinet part, in these quarter tones. So the piece is called Wax and Wire, because it's inspired by these wire sculptures created by an artist named Michael Gard.
Yes, and if I could just, I want to emphasize here that we've contacted Michael and he's given us permission to use images of his sculpture. So we're very grateful to Michael for that.
Oh,
Please
great.
go on and tell us more about the relationship of the music to those sculptures.
Sure. Yes. So I remember seeing these sculptures for the first time. I was in Baltimore at an arts fair in a convention center, and there was this kind of space where there were these sculptures hanging from the ceiling, and I think the lights were low and they were kind of lit up, and it was really beautiful. But they're made out of wire, and they're of various forms. The most striking one I think is one of like a dancer, and I was really inspired by the sculpture itself, but also the process behind it is where he has a wax form that he carves from wax. And then he weaves the wire around the wax. And then at the end, he melts all the wax out, leaving just the wire. And I found that to be such an interesting sort of uh, starting point to be inspired by a piece of art. And so I also was inspired by the idea of wax and wire being like malleable
Mhm.
materials. The wax being something sort of, it's like a solid, but you can like kind of, um, it's almost like squishy feeling, and you can carve it easily. And then wire, of course, is solid, but it's very easily bendable. And I think of the clarinet quarter tones as sort of this in between space. Whereas the piano, you have the chromatic scale, um, and it's pretty rigid. That's just you press the notes and they're equal tempered, and it's
Mhm.
just a chromatic scale. Whereas a violin glissando, where they slide their finger along a string, it's extremely malleable. It's very almost like liquidy. It sounds like something is quite literally melting. And then the quarter tone, it's like in between glissando and in between the rigidity of a piano chromatic scale. So the theme of the piece is there are these sort of smearing effects where I layer the piano half step chromatic scale with clarinet quarter tones with the violin glissando. And my hope is that it sounds kind of like what it feels like to bend a wire.
I really like that metaphor of that oral representation of the smear and how you incorporate all the instruments into that unifying concept. Brings us back to that cohesion element. Now, you have a lot of experience writing along those lines because doesn't your composition Fine Lines also use drawings and dancers in particular, right?
Yes, so I have a piece called Fine Lines, which is for a chamber ensemble as well. It's like a quintet instrumentation. That also has piano, piano, violoncello, clarinet. It's basically like the instrumentation of wax wire, but with flute.
Mm.
That piece, there are different movements, and some of them are very different than others. But the unifying thing in that piece is all the movements are inspired by line drawings by Picasso. Um,
Yes.
and there is one movement, there's a clarinet sort of feature movement in that piece too that also uses clarinet quarter tones, but kind of in a very different way than wax and wire.
Now you were talking about the violin glissandi, but it ends really effectively with sort of a pluck. Could you tell us about its cadence there at the end and how you arrive at that?
Yes. So sometimes as a composer, you feel like you can either end a piece loudly and really big, like with a big bang, or you can end it very softly and kind of have it fade away. And in this piece, I wanted to kind of in the spirit of the clarinet chord tone being an in-between thing, have an ending that was simultaneously sort of a big kind of burst of energy, but also something that felt like it was like melting away. And
Yeah.
so the piece at the end, not to give it away, but I'll just say it does feel like there is a sort of decrescendo to the ending, but it also feels like there's a sort of exclamation point at the
Yeah.
end.
We'll put a little plot spoiler before we
Yeah.
mention that. You would also mention before about your interview saying before the pandemic, and I'm wondering how did the pandemic affect your approach to composition? Like, how do you practice music differently now that we're hopefully coming out of it?
Yeah, I think for me, there's kind of a very distinct sort of turning point in the music that I was writing. Like prior to the pandemic, the last sort of performances that I had were pieces that were very sort of ecstatic and kind of at times very funny. I have this piece for double oboe, or it's a double oboe concerto, and that piece is like me kind of using Baroque music in a humorous way, and it's funny. The two oboists are like basically arguing with each other. And that was premiered December 2019, so like mere months before COVID had happened here in the US anyway. And like during the pandemic, I really kind of turned inward, and I was writing a lot of chamber and solo music because that's what people were needing at the time, was like kind of small pieces that could be performed virtually or put together safely with small groups. And so I wrote a lot of music, but it was kind of like it was like I was distilling myself, kind of taking everything that I've written and learned over the years, but like just really writing the notes that I felt were really important, or using harmonies that were very simple and comforting. Because I kind of used those pieces to find comfort at that time. So I have some pieces like cello octet comes to mind. It's a cello octet I wrote for cellist in Balsigev called Room to Move. And she recorded all 8 parts. So it's like kind of like chamber piece, but it was like almost like a solo piece. And it was just like using it, the piece just uses really simple harmonies, and kind of it's all about texture. But I found that when I like wrote that piece, it felt like a catharsis, like like I had kind of found a way to deal with all of the feelings of loneliness and isolation that we were all feeling at the time.
Sure. And what are you working on now?
Let's see. So I'm writing well, I'm working on a couple things. I'm making a version of a tuba concerto that was originally conceived with band. I'm making a version with orchestra. And I'm writing a big piece for orchestra as well. And also I'm writing a piece this summer for like flute, soprano, and percussion. So kind of a mix of different things. But yeah, excited in coming seasons writing kind of big pieces for orchestra, or other bigger pieces for orchestra as well. So and my main project now is a piano concerto.
Piano concerto.
Yeah.
That's a big undertaking.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the piano concerto is one of those things where like for the longest time I was like, I can't do something like that. It's too like there's too many good piano concertos, and you know, how do you compete with Tchaikovsky or Grieg? But eventually I just like was like, well, I have this way I like to write for piano. I just want to kind of do it and not really think about other piano concertos and just do what I want to do. And it's been
Right.
freeing.
Well, we greatly appreciate you taking out the time to speak with me today. And I hope audiences will join Network for New Music on February 26th and 27th to hear Viet Cuong's Wax and Wire. Thanks so much for joining us today, Viet.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who's performing it. I wish you could be there, but have fun.
Thank you.